Dobrodošli, ja sam Azra Hadžić, a ovo je Jazeera Svijet. Od početka rata protiv Gaze udvostručen broj palestinskih zatvorenika u izraelskim zatvorima. Trenutno ih je blizu 10.000. Mračno doba nizozemskog kolonijalizma. Kakvi su se zločini pokušali zataškati i kako su se Indonežani izborili za svoju neovisnost. U Kini i Butanu obrazovani mladi ljudi sve teže dolaze do posla. S kakvim se izazovima suočavaju? 17. april obilježava se kao Dan palestinskih zatvorenika, posvećen slobodi zatočenih u izraelskim zatvorima i podršci njihovim pravima. Od početka rata protiv Gaze u oktobru 2023. udvostručen je broj pritvorenih Palestinaca i trenutno ih je blizu 10.000. To uključuje i 3.500 onih u administrativnom pritvoru bez optužnice ili suđenja. Ubai Al-Abudi, direktor Centra za istraživanje i razvoj iz Ramale, bio je u zatvoru bez optužnice godinu dana. Kaže kako je glavni cilj izraelskog zatvorskog sistema u potpunosti potčiniti Palestince.
The Israeli prison system is a carceral system of the maintaining that aims to maintain the apartheid and the subjugation of the Palestinian people. When you have a statistic that's 1 in every 5 Palestinians that have been arrested, and you understand also that 50% of our population is our children under the age of 18, then you are talking about roughly 1 in every 2 adult males have been arrested and subjugated, criminalized by the Israeli authorities. This system aims to break the Palestinian will, the Palestinian resilience, aims to put severe punishments on Palestinians from all sorts. It's only in Israeli jails that you will find doctors, physicists, professors, academics, civil society, activists, the creme de la creme of Palestinian society being targeted, incarcerated, because Israel does not want any kind of Palestinian agency, any kind of Palestinian collective action, any kind of Palestinian leadership. Well, when you say children, there has been a term coined by a Palestinian academic called de-childing. De-childing means that you are taking away a child, treating him as a criminal, and children can be as young. The youngest has been 7 years old, if you want to understand the impact of this. Have been taken away from their parents, from their family, from their homes, often in the middle of the night, taken out of their beds, put in prisons, beaten up, attacked. Some of them are sexually assaulted. The famous case documented by DCIP that was revealed by Josh Paul, the former diplomat at the State Department, when a Palestinian child was raped during interrogation by Israeli officials, Israeli Shabak officials, and this was back in 2019. So when we're talking about the systematic abuse of Palestinians, of the childing of Palestinians. We are talking about systematic torture. The figure even of Palestinians killed since October 2023 has risen to 64. A 20-year-old young man today was reported being killed in Israeli prisons with no prior medical conditions. He was set to be released a couple of days after. This is something that you need to understand. There is no legal system protecting Palestinians. Palestinians stand in front of military courts, which is military judges, that they are part of the same system that subjugates the Palestinians, that orders, for example, total siege on Gaza, that orders the destruction of Palestinian homes.
Jeste li se ikada zapitali kako je tako mala zemlja poput Nizozemske postala jedna od najbogatijih na svijetu? 17. augusta 1945. Indonezija je proglasila neovisnost od stoljeća nizozemske kolonizacije. Bila je to mračna povijest nasilja, iskorištavanja i robovskog rada koju je bivše carstvo pokušalo zataškati. Iako se 2022. godine nizozemski premijer izvinio nakon što je studija koju je finansirala vlada postupke te zemlje tokom indonezijskog rata za neovisnost nazvala sistematskim i ekstremnim nasiljem, Neki dalje smatraju da je takav potez nepotpun, te žele odštetu za dugogodišnje ropstvo i oduzimanje resursa. Premda je istraživanje otkrilo da čak 50% Nizozemaca misli da je kolonijalizam nešto čime se treba ponositi, a ne stidjeti, u narednom dokumentarnom filmu govorimo kakvi su to zločini obilježili nizozemsku vladavinu u toj regiji.
It's December 9th, 1947, in the village of Rawagede in Indonesia. Dutch soldiers are storming homes and banging on doors in the early morning. 2 years before, Indonesians had declared independence from 3 centuries of Dutch colonization. But the Netherlands was desperately clinging on. Dutch soldiers were under orders to, quote, cleanse the area of pro-independence fighters. When the villagers said they knew nothing, males, some as young as 15, were separated and interrogated. These are the words of a survivor who was 5 years old during the Rawagede massacre.
There were dogs looking for those who hid in the woods. The dogs barked, followed by more gunshots. That river turned red with blood.
On that day in Rawagede, the Dutch army killed up to 431 people. Official Dutch sources downplay the death toll, but these photos of the massacre were discovered decades later. In them, 2 men in military uniforms stand next to a ditch filled with bodies. At the time, they were the sole photographic evidence of Dutch mass executions during the war. It was a lack of evidence like these photos that helped the Netherlands conceal the true extent of its brutality for decades. So how were the full horrors of Rawagede eventually revealed? And what else did the Dutch Empire unleash on Indonesia?
From the outset, massacres have been part and parcel of Dutch colonialism.
The Rawagede massacre is a microcosm of Dutch atrocities in Indonesia spanning centuries. We'll get to that in a bit. But first, the story of how the Dutch were forced to confront the massacre can start with this man, Jeffrey Pandag. He was born in Indonesia a few years after the massacre in Rawagede, today known as Bolongsari. Jeffrey grew up hearing stories about Dutch colonial violence.
Kolonialisme is, behalve dat ze dus mensen vermoorden, is voor de mentaliteit, is dat gewoon heel vreselijk.
When he was 16, Jeffrey moved to the Netherlands and he was in for a culture shock.
Zo worden wij natuurlijk hier voorgesteld door die historici, de televisie en de kranten die schrijven naar. Ja, en wij zijn dus zeg maar de boosdoeners. En toen dacht ik van, er moet iets wat gebeuren.
So he got to work. He became sort of a public figure, writing open letters to the Dutch government and speaking to the media about the impacts of Dutch colonialism. In 2011, Jeffrey and human rights lawyers achieved what many said was impossible. They won the first successful lawsuit against the Netherlands for the Rawagede massacre after a Dutch court bypassed the statute of limitations, allowing a group of widows to sue. In the settlement, the Netherlands paid $21,000 to each of the 9 surviving widows and offered an apology. The lawsuit got the ball rolling. More lawsuits for other executions during the war were filed. In 2020, the Dutch king apologized, calling the atrocities
excessive violence on the part of the Dutch in those years.
And in 2022, the Prime Minister also apologized after a government-sponsored study called the Netherlands' actions during the Indonesian War of Independence, quote, systematic and extreme violence. But some, like Jeffrey, accuse the Netherlands of using words like excessive and extreme to shield itself from international accountability.
Dat ze dus bang zijn om zeg maar, die schade die ze hebben gemaakt 1 op 1 terug te betalen. En daarom houden ze eigen koers.
So what other colonial atrocities have the Dutch kept quiet about? Let's go from the beginning of Dutch colonization to the Indonesian War of Independence to understand how atrocities characterized Dutch rule in the region. Dutch colonization in Indonesia began in the 17th century, when there was a grab for empire between European powers. The Dutch had colonies from Africa to North and South America to Asia, but our story will focus right here in modern-day Indonesia, then known as the Dutch East Indies. In the early 1600s, Governor-General of the Dutch East India Company, Jan Pieterszoon Koen, traveled to the Banda Islands in modern-day Indonesia. Back then, the islands were the sole source of a prized commodity, nutmeg. The island traded with the Dutch at first, but the Dutch had other plans. They wanted a monopoly on the spice trade, and then
Jan Pieterszoon Koen decided to end the conflict once and for all and started a war in Banda, which resulted in a massacre and the expulsion and enslavement of almost all of the Bandanese people. This is a classic case of genocide.
That's Remco Robin. He's a professor at the University of Amsterdam researching Dutch colonial-era violence. He researches numerous instances of massacres during centuries of Dutch colonization, painting the empire as
a war machine. 350 years afterwards, there was hardly a year went by without several wars going on.
After the Banda massacre, the Dutch took over these regions in modern-day Indonesia, violently suppressing resistance to their conquests. People were forced into slave labor to produce commodities that the Netherlands would sell for large profits in Europe and North America. In addition to slavery, the Dutch imposed other brutal forms of forced labor. During the 19th century, the island of Java faced the cultivation system, which is when villages had to set aside parts of their land to produce commodities for the Dutch. Meanwhile, villagers themselves were often deprived of the crops necessary for their own survival. So many Javanese died from malnutrition and from diseases caused by unsanitary working conditions.
Colonial profits are for a large part based on the forced labor of people. In the 1840s and 1850s, as much as 30 or even 40% or more of the state budget came out of the cultivation system.
Before we go into how Indonesians overthrew Dutch rule, let's talk about how they resisted the Netherlands' colonial presence for centuries. Although Dutch rule in the East Indies was harsh, there were several examples of resistance during this period. The Aceh Sultanate in northern Sumatra had resisted foreign domination throughout its history. And in 1873, the Sultanate fought back against the Netherlands' attempts at invasion. But Aceh was also the source of the world's largest black pepper supply at that time, and the Dutch weren't prepared to give up such a valuable commodity. So they turned to scorched earth tactics. Everything was a target: homes, fields, irrigation systems. Anything that could be used to help the resistance was destroyed. The war lasted for 3 decades. By 1904, tens of thousands of Akanese had fled or were killed. But word of the Aceh Sultanate spread.
Indonesia implies the inclusion of nearly all the East Indian islands. The leader of the movement is Dr. Sukarno.
By the early 20th century, the war had set the stage for a unified independence movement across the archipelago. The Indonesian national awakening was when populations across the Dutch East Indies formed a collective identity in opposition to foreign domination.
Mass meetings at many places in Java and Sumatra called upon the people to present a united front to the Dutch and their allies.
It became a powerful threat to Dutch rule. The Dutch Empire tried to repress the movement by exiling and imprisoning revolutionaries. But then World War II began.
Japan's march to the new order in Asia staggers the imagination.
Japan invaded the islands, taking them from the Netherlands. But on August 15th, 1945, Japan announced its surrender. Indonesian leaders declared their independence 2 days later.
Since the defeat of Japan, the administrative buildings for the whole of Java have been taken over and run by the self-appointed regime. Head of the Indonesian movement is the self-styled president, Dr. Sukarno.
But the Dutch still weren't willing to let go, which led to the Indonesian War of Independence. Villages were burned and people were massacred. Cultural heritage and artifacts were looted, and crops were obliterated.
The Indonesian forces themselves also applied scorched earth tactics in order to destroy everything and not to give it into the hands of the Dutch.
And with the advent of TV and radio, their fight was broadcast across the globe.
With participants being chased and arrested, it's a hectic scene.
And the military situation became worse and worse. The Dutch couldn't control the areas they just occupied. Secondly, among the elites in the Netherlands, the political and also economic elites, there was an increasing tendency to end the war.
After international pressure and a lengthy diplomatic process, the Dutch transferred power to Indonesia on December 27, 1949. For decades, that's the date the Netherlands recognized as Indonesians' Independence Day. But wait, there's one last colonial twist. Remember, Indonesians actually declared their independence 4 years earlier, on August 17, 1945. And that's just one reason why Indonesians say apologies for Dutch actions during the War of Independence are incomplete. Some want reparations for slavery and the extraction of resources that decimated the archipelago while making the Netherlands one of the richest countries on earth.
Dat geld die ze dus vergaard hebben met bloed aan de handen, die dus zeg maar ja, hun rijkdom hier zeg maar mogelijk hebben gemaakt, ja, aan ons toch zeg maar teruggeven. En voor wat? Voor de Indonesische volk.
In fact, statues in the Netherlands of former colonizers, like this one of Jan Pieterszoon Koen, glorify those who brutalized Indonesians.
The Dutch East India Company, or Dutch colonialism in general, is still romanticized. It was found that 50% of the Dutch were thinking that colonialism was more something to be proud of than to be ashamed of.
And other former Dutch colonies are seeking justice for their historical traumas. In 2023, the Netherlands apologized for its role in the Caribbean slave trade, calling it a crime against humanity. Still, economic disparities continue in these former plantation colonies.
De historicus die vertelt gewoon geschiedvervalsing. Omdat ze vanuit gaan dat het land die 18.000 kilometer ver is, van Nederland is. Terwijl dat niet zo is.
The Dutch aren't the only ones with an enduring legacy of colonialism.
U nastavku emisije idemo do Kine. Više od 12 miliona novih diplomaca ove godine ući će na kinesko tržište rada, ali posla nema dovoljno za sve. Stopa nezaposlenosti mladih u toj državi porasla je na 16,1% u januaru sa 15,7% u decembru 2024. Jessica Washington izvještava iz Šangaja o izazovima s kojima se suočavaju mladi u pokušaju pronalaska posla u usporenoj ekonomiji.
U gradovima širom Kine sajmovi poslova poput ovog privlače posjetioce iz cijele zemlje. Jedan od tražitelja posla je Chin Shilin. Ovaj 21-godišnji diplomac informatike trenutno boravi kod ujaka dok traži posao u velikom gradu.
应聘了30-40份工作吧，也在家乡那边，就是。
Milioni mladih poput Čina su na izazovnom tržištu rada, dok faktori poput usporavanja sektora nekretnina, slabe potrošnje i očekivanog pada izvoza utječu na ekonomiju.
The job market is getting increasingly competitive for graduates. More than 12 million young people are set to graduate this year. That's an increase of more than 430,000 compared to last year.
Zvanični podaci ukazuju na stopu nezaposlenosti mladih od 16%, ali stručnjaci kažu da je ta brojka vjerovatno viša, a podaci ne obuhvataju mlade koji su zaposleni na skraćeno vrijeme ili one koji rade poslove na kojima nisu iskorištena njihova znanja i vještine.
With the real estate sector down, that is construction down, infrastructure down, and new technologies not absorbing large numbers, you have a large body of people who simply can't find jobs at the moment.
Uz neizvjesno tržište rada, konkurencija za radna mjesta u državnoj službi raste, jer se smatraju stabilnom karijerom koja nudi sigurnost posla i pogodnosti poput subvencionisanog smještaja. Više od 3 miliona kandidata polagalo ispit za državnu službu krajem prošle godine, što je povećanje od više od 400.000 u odnosu na prethodnu godinu. Uprkos izazovima, Čin kaže da je optimističan kad je riječ o nalaženju posla u gradu.
大城市机会多，说不定还能找个女朋友什么的，有好工作了也能找个女朋友什么的，这也挺可以的。
Ovo mu je prva posjeta sajmu poslova. Nada se da ih neće morati posjetiti mnogo prije nego što nađe adekvatan posao.
I Butan se bori da osigura radna mjesta za svoje sve obrazovanije mlade stanovnike. Gotovo 20% građana između 15 i 24 godine je nezaposleno, što je problem koji je premijer države opisao egzistencijalnim. Bernard Smith ima više detalja.
Narodna generacija u Butanu najobrazovanija je u toj državi. Govore engleski i kompjuterski su pismeni. Napredak u obrazovanju bio je među faktorima koji su pomogli ovom malom himalajskom kraljevstvu da se prije 2 godine povuče sa UN-ove liste najmanje razvijenih zemalja. Međutim, ova ekonomija ne može držati korak sa svojim kvalifikovanim diplomcima. Zato mnogi poput Jeste i Fancoa žele siguran i pouzdan posao u vladi.
I just want to appear the civil service examination and then get into civil service and serve my country.
Did you look at what other options you could have?
I can't say that I did not. I did try to, but then there's not much to look at in Bhutan right now.
I see civil service as a form of experience for at least 10 to 20 years until I figure out what I truly want to do in life. Another option would obviously be self-employment or going into business, but then you need funding for that. You also need a market for that. And our country, as you already know, we don't have many people compared to other nations. That's why I feel like business is not a viable option, especially for young people like myself.
9% stanovništva Butana, najmanje 64.000 ljudi, odselilo se u inozemstvo, većinom u Australiju, u potrazi za boljim prilikama.
Bhutan's Prime Minister says the exodus of its educated, most productive age group is this country's biggest existential threat. And you do get the feeling here that there is this race against time to try and diversify the economy, to provide opportunities to stop young people leaving.
No, za sada tih prilika nema.
Dele yale jutu nimle ngai tausum ni de chide debra deila yo machi anebe deila dele ngachigi ngacharagi shechigi ani yogi gokap tisu
pecha amchi matani digela laya thomi sube se junibingila dele ngachi la namnyong ne mini digi khongge je mitubela de la top de beruya.
Bhutan ima ambiciozan plan ekonomskog razvoja koji uključuje izgradnju novog metropolisa od nule, zvanog Gelefu Mindfulness City, specijalne administrativne regije. Međutim, malo domaće tržište, nedostatak ekonomije i infrastrukturna ograničenja znače da će nalaženje poslova za sljedeću generaciju i dalje biti izazovno.
To je sve u ovom izdanju Jazeera Svijeta. Ako ste nešto propustili, sadržaj emisije možete pronaći na web stranici i YouTube kanalu. Doviđenja!